I know the way that I'm seen now in the Home Office. I'm seen as a bit of a traitor, like I've betrayed the department in some way. It was constantly mad and constantly chaotic. Loads of people were left, I mean, for over a decade. Some people still haven't got a visa. They're just living undocumented. They can't open a bank account. They can't rent a house. They can't move on with their lives at all. I was in the Home Office working on this brief at the time that all this scandal happened, and I'm now going along to meet the people at the sharp end of this who've been directly affected by it. When I was in Brussels in 2010, I'd see Farage around the place, around the European Council at these big meetings, and he was just this guy that was a bit of a joke, you know. He'd be there propping up the bar with his pint of ale, his tweed jacket, you know, no one took him seriously. He was sort of seen as an insurgent, like trying to take down the EU from the inside. And now all of a sudden he's being taken seriously, and people like really established, legitimate political commentators are talking about what might a reform government look like. You know, that is really scary.
Nicola Kelly, journalist and author. We are talking to you today because we're sort of earlier this month, Labour introduced their new white paper. They introduced their new immigration plan, and I think it shocked a number of Labour members that it was perhaps more on the extreme side than some members were hoping for. We're talking to you because you worked in the Home Office for a number of years, and it was right in the moment, just after Theresa May's Get Out vans, Go Home vans, were circulating the capital. Can you talk to me a little bit about what the feeling was inside the Home Office at that time?
Yeah, so by way of background, I'd worked at the Foreign Office for about 5 years, and then I was promised a sort of international-facing job working for the Home Office. So I was put on the Immigration and Security Desk, as it was known at the time. It was 2014. It was the height of the hostile environment. The Go Home vans, as you said, had been circulating. The tens of thousands pledge that Cameron had said that he was going to be able to get net migration down to the tens of thousands. That had been pledged. There was this whole thing around sham marriages. Like, it was, the hostile environment was like alive and well. The environment was, and I hear it's exactly the same now, around net migration figures coming out, it was absolutely like febrile. Like, people would be running up and down the stairs, up to SPAD's offices, up to private office on the 3rd floor, like printers stalling, paper being ripped, like people just cursing and just running up and down the stairs. And I just remember the sound of like heels like clacking in the atrium, like people just running around. It was constantly mad and constantly chaotic, but particularly around net migration figures, it was just really busy. I didn't particularly love it. In fact, someone said recently, like, the shortest sentence in the entire book is, I hated it, which sort of sums up my entire experience. And off the back of that, I left the civil service. It wasn't my bag.
I think this is actually quite interesting insider information for people who aren't familiar with how this sort of works inside departments. So when the net migration figures are coming out, what would your job be? What would your role be in the time leading up to that publication?
So we in press office would get the figure like a couple of days beforehand. Policy paper would have been issued already, and we would come up with a media handling plan. So we would be sort of up and down to private office, working with SPADs and figuring out a set of messages that we would want to issue around that. Then we would be proactively briefing certain journalists. So usually, and it still works exactly the same way, it would be sort of friendly outlets. So
I've never had the call.
I've never had the call. So I'm like, I know why I haven't had the call as well. Like, you know, I know the way that I'm seen now in the Home Office. I'm seen as a bit of a traitor, like I've betrayed the department in some way. I'm in touch with lots of former colleagues, but some of them speak to me and some of them don't so much. So yeah, it's net migration figures like a particularly potent issue, and there's always a really carefully constructed media handling plan around that. So the proactive calls will go out to like tabloids, broadcasters, and you see it now in press conferences. Like, the Prime Minister will pick certain journalists that he knows, but he'll never pick people from like unfriendly outlets or like left-leaning outlets, I guess. So we would have a media handling plan of specific journalists that we want to target. We proactively brief them and not worry so much about the sort of the journalists that might not be issuing such favourable coverage.
It's interesting because I suppose you were actually there during the time when we've just heard from Starmer that there's going to be this crackdown on care workers and their dependents. That was first introduced under the Conservatives, but it's sort of been ramped up by Starmer. The original version of that was about foreign students or international
Mhm.
students, and you were there during that crackdown. Is that right?
Yeah, so that was 2014. So there was a Panorama documentary that had come out, and there was a student visa scandal that sort of happened around that time. It was one of so many scandals that happened around that time. But that was basically the reason why I left the Home Office and left the civil service completely. So they said that proxies were sitting these English language tests for people students who were looking to sort of extend their visas. They said that they had paid cheats basically to sort of dupe the Home Office. And Theresa May was showing this footage on camera and she was outraged and said, there needs to be a crackdown. And they basically revoked like 130,000 visas overnight. Loads of people were left. I mean, for over a decade, some people still haven't got a visa. They're just living undocumented. They can't open a bank account. They can't rent a house. They can't move on with their lives at all. Some people returned, were totally stigmatized in their communities. Some people took their own lives. It was this absolutely massive scandal, and like on an enormous scale. No one really talks about it, and I think it's like on a par with the Windrush scandal, other scandals of that kind, but it just hasn't had the attention. I'm not quite sure why, but it hasn't had the attention that the Windrush scandal has had. But it's enormous, and it still affects tens of thousands of people, some living in the UK and some living back in their home countries.
I sort of feel I feel terrible because I was going to go off the angle of what happened to the universities who were then sort of they couldn't bring in all of these foreign students. But yeah, of course, there's the human
Yeah,
side to all of this as well, of all of those people who were suddenly
yeah.
will found themselves undocumented.
Yeah, and there's a woman I write about in the book who says she pulled me aside and they were giving a petition into Number 10. And I was standing outside with them, and I sort of walked along with a bit of trepidation, thinking I was in the Home Office working on this brief at the time that all this scandal happened. And I'm now going along to meet the people at the sharp end of this who've been directly affected by it. So I was quite like apprehensive about the way that I would be perceived, that maybe I was complicit in some way, that maybe I had harmed them and like had an impact on their lives. And they were lovely, lovely bunch of people. But there was one woman called Tanvi, Indian woman, who'd come over to do a master's degree. And she had been left undocumented, and she said she wasn't able to conceive, she wasn't able to have a baby, and she thinks it's because of the stress that this has put on her
Wow.
over the last decade. So it's like it's massive, and yeah, it's really unheard of and unspoken.
Because I think you can really feel this with the new crackdown on care workers applying for visas to the UK. There's a number of people who've uprooted their lives and they've come and they've settled here and they've chosen to live in the UK.
Yeah.
And now they're being told that they might have to wait, double the time to receive their indefinite leave to remain.
Yeah. So care workers, this immigration white paper, the two sort of significant parts of it was the care workers and then the indefinite leave to remain extending or doubling. The care workers was successive governments and prime ministers tend to do this. They sort of see the health and social care visa route as a tap that they can kind of turn on and off depending on where the net migration figure falls. So in 2022, the Tories opened up that route because they needed more people in to fill a number of vacancies. I think it was about 130,000, which it still is. And they opened up that route. It was post-pandemic, post-Brexit. They needed more people in. And then in 2023, the net migration figure spiked. They basically contracted that route. They completely shut it down again. And 3 days after that, I went to a care home in Scarborough and was shadowing a guy called Evans who'd come over as a registered nurse from Ghana. Amazing guy. I still think about that day all the time. It was really moving to see like the work that they did, which so many people don't want to do. About half the staff were overseas workers. So there was 31 overseas workers there, like mainly West African, some East African and South Asian. And then others were Brits hired locally. And yeah, like he loved his work. He came over wanting to do this work, and he was like absolutely run off his feet the entire time. And to see the like racial abuse that he got for doing his job, like some people were saying, I don't want you to touch me because, because he was a black guy. It was absolutely like, I've seen many things, I've heard about like racial abuse, like for many people who come over here, but to see it and to hear it was really shocking. I was really like, I was really shocked by it.
And obviously that's what they're receiving at the bedside. The language
Yeah.
from government level, particularly the sort of low skilled work,
Yes.
does that this is going to sound awful. Do they know that that's how they're being talked about or described?
I think because they're hearing it from families, and not just the people who are, elderly people who could be sort of not forgiven, but you could understand, that they're not totally, some of them are like have Alzheimer's and whatnot, but it's the families, the younger members of the families who are, racially abusing some of these care workers. It's absolutely
Oh.
horrific. Yeah. So, it's really awful to see. But the care home provider at that care home in Scarborough, Mike Padgham, was saying without people like Evans, we would have to have closed our home, a year ago. Maybe we would have to close now. And as a business owner, he didn't want to say, we will have to close our homes without overseas care workers, but that's the situation we're in. Like the NHS, there's no bed spaces. Like we are propping up the NHS in many ways. If we fail, the NHS fails, is what he said. And that really struck a chord with me. And I was just thinking, social care is totally like, he'd run out of words to describe how bad it was. He was like, it's on a precipice, on the verge, like at breaking point. There's no words to describe how bad it is. And I really got an insight into how bad it was when I was there shadowing Evans for that day.
In the book, you open, you're talking about traveling across the channel. You're talking about asylum. Often that is conflated with net migration figures. Can you just sort of, in layman's terms, talk about the difference between seeking asylum when you come to the UK and what it is to come here, say, through the carer route?
Yeah, so the government talk about this in terms of legal and illegal migration. Others talk about it in terms of irregular routes. So asylum seekers crossing the channel accounts for about 5% of overall immigration to the country. It's absolutely minuscule. So when that net migration figure comes out, like the government are totally fixated on it, and it's halved. It's a fraction of what it was. But yeah, I think it is very often conflated that the small boat crossings in particular are seen as a proxy for immigration as a whole, but the numbers are absolutely tiny. Legal migration is the routes that most people come through. So it will be sort of, the care worker visa route or the student visa route. They're sort of legal routes where people will come safely. And when campaigners talk about safe routes, that's what they're talking about. So they're talking about people being able to fly in with a visa and ideally get work immediately, create a life, put down roots and move forward.
What happens to those asylum seekers who do travel here, say by these quote unquote irregular routes? When they get here, is it as rosy as it's told to us by some of the more right-wing press? Do they have recourse to public funds? Are they put up in a wonderful home? What actually happens?
Yeah, there's a whole rhetoric around like 4-star hotels, 5-star hotels. But there's just so many total misconceptions about what happens to people when they actually arrive here. They land on UK soil. They'll obviously have risked their lives, their children's lives, crossing the channel in these boats. They'll often have been up against like extreme violence on that border as well. People are being pushed around that border to take longer, more perilous routes as well at the moment, packed into boats with about 100 people. So they will arrive totally shaken. And seeing people arriving is, until I had seen people actually arriving on our shores, I'd just seen pictures or like news coverage of it. Until I actually saw people getting off those boats with my own eyes, I was like, those people, meters away, like a few minutes ago, they could have been in the water, they could have drowned. It's these people walking up the gangway now. So they set foot on UK soil. They'll be taken into start the process, basically, totally shaken up, totally traumatized from that journey. They'll then be usually put into sort of holding accommodation, is the way I see it, sort of a few days, usually in a hotel near an airport. They'll give their biometrics, so they'll give things like fingerprints and their date of birth and their names and things like that. They'll start the process from there. Some people are put into Manston, which is basically a holding pen in Kent.
And
And
it's
then
awful.
it's awful. Yeah, there was like at one point there was like 4,000 people there, totally overcrowded, like diphtheria, rats running around, people sleeping on the floors. Like it's horrendous conditions.
I read about a woman who, well, Charity told me about a woman who miscarried
Yeah,
there, and she blames it. You can't attribute it to one thing, obviously, but she blames it.
stress.
Yeah, stress.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, you hear stories like this all the time, that there's absolutely horrific things happening there and nobody really knows about it. So once they leave Manson, they'll be dispersed. And this is what I was trying to do with the book, was basically follow people from that point of departure as they arrived. They have a few days in these holding facilities, and then they're dispersed to different villages and towns and cities across the UK. Usually people are put up in hotels. Labour are trying to close down those hotels now, not that successfully, or they're put into former military barracks like Napier in Kent.
Which
And
again is awful.
yeah, absolutely horrendous. So that's like dorms. They're like, yeah, totally blacked out windows. They just get chips and burgers every day. And there's constantly like far right, less so now actually, but like Farage goes along there all the time. There's people filming outside all the time. There's like a guy was like flying a drone over Napier and trying to like film into it. They try and make out like these facilities, the hotels or the military barracks, are like, wonderful accommodation. They're being like given really nice food and stuff. It's absolutely horrendous. Like the conditions are awful, and as you say, like awful things happen in there, and really often people don't know about it.
Well, even down in Manston, excuse me, we went to one. I always forget the name of this. It was out in Kent. It was deep in Essex. It was like a.
Wethersfield?
It is Wethersfield.
Yeah.
The conditions there are horrific.
Yeah.
We spoke to a number of people who were being held there. They were complaining about not receiving water despite begging for water.
Yeah.
I mean, they were being given rotten fruit every
Yeah.
single day. There was a man who had a broken leg who was being refused treatment.
Yeah.
It's
like-
not luxurious.
Absolutely not. And like lack of access to medical care is like one of the main things. And like mental health is such a huge thing among asylum seekers. So the fact that they haven't got any access to medical care, the conditions are so bad. And often when I go to northern France into the camps and they say, England's great, isn't it? Like you don't want people to give up hope, because it's almost like for lots of people in the UK, they always say England, but the UK is seen as a bit of an end point, because they're like, I've traveled for thousands of miles. I've gone through all of these, horrendous experiences. We're here now. This is the last like stepping stone, basically. And then we can lay down roots and move on with our lives. And you don't want people to give up hope. But equally, it's difficult to say. Like, it's not what you think it will be. It's pretty awful what we're about to put you through, and you don't want people to give up hope, but it's important to be realistic, I think, about what it's actually like when people get here.
That conflation, I think, between asylum seekers, which you say is 5%, compared to the huge number of net migration, do you think that has been extraordinarily unhelpful? This is a very leading question for the public consciousness of immigration, because it sort of feels, I think that when we're out and about voxing people, most would imagine that everyone who has migrated here, that enormous 750,000 figure, are all people who've travelled on small boats.
Yeah. And they'll be like, oh, it's the illegals coming in and stuff. But this is just like, Farage, the far right, like they have such a potent set of messages on this issue. It's so simple. It's so digestible. And, like Starmer, Labour, the Tories before them, they can't compete on that set of messages. Like there's nothing that they can say to beat net zero migration. And some of this rhetoric, which Starmer now seems to be adopting some of this rhetoric, taking back control and sort of Brexit era narrative. But adopting this rhetoric isn't helpful in any way, because then people will think, oh, they are illegal. And it's like, we need to not be using language like that. Migrants, asylum seekers, we just talk about them as people and talk about irregular routes and like slightly more measured language. But like Starmer and the government seems to be going after what Farage is doing on this rhetoric as well, which is really damaging.
And if they follow in the route of Nigel Farage, and you have already mentioned that Starmer is hoping to close the Asylum hotels. Sorry, I've just done it again. But, just for the purposes of the tape, so people know what I'm talking about. I mean, can Farage close all of those hotels? Tomorrow, if they were all, the doors were shut, the money was cut off, what would happen to those people?
Well, they'd be homeless, but it almost doesn't matter like what he says because people just buy it. They'll just because it is so simple, and he can say, "I'm going to close down all the hotels," net zero migration. Like it's impossible to do that. But if that's what you're promising people, and you say it with enough confidence and conviction, people are going to believe it. And there are so many people disillusioned with what Labour are doing. The Tories like totally obsolete now. Like there are so many people that voted Labour incredibly disappointed, people who would have been progressive, a younger voter base potentially, who are now leaning towards Labour. It's really extraordinary and quite scary that we've got to this point where the Tories are so obsolete that it's basically a two-horse race between Labour and Reform. Like it's absolutely like mind-blowing. Like when I was in Brussels in 2010, I'd see Farage around the place, around the European Council at these big meetings, and he was just this guy that was a bit of a joke. He'd be there propping up the bar with his pint of ale, his tweed jacket. No one took him seriously. He was sort of seen as an insurgent, like trying to take down the EU from the inside. And now all of a sudden he's being taken seriously, and people like really established, legitimate political commentators are talking about what might a reform government look like. That is really scary. Like we're at quite a moment, and immigration will form such a massive part of what we're talking about over the next 4 years. But yeah, I think it's just we're at such a scary moment, and I don't know, like, how do we row back from here?
And do you think that he's influencing Labour policy?
Oh, massively, yeah. This immigration white paper was basically just an answer, like a call straight after the local election results, dire results for the Tories, but pretty bad for Labour as well. And yeah, I mean, he was running scared of Farage. Starmer was running scared of Farage and was just like, we need to do something. We need to issue some quite drastic measures on this. We need to be talking about axing visa routes, axing the care worker visa route completely, just because they're so fixated, like to the point of obsession with getting the net migration figure down. Actually, net migration had been dropping for over a year. And then we saw that it was half, it had halved. And so he didn't really need to be doing any of this, but it was just like, we need to be seen as tough. We need to be seen to be doing something on this in the wake of the local election results. So, and with all of that, with all the policies, the rhetoric follows. So it's sort of this island of strangers language and, taking back control. And yeah, I mean, it's just mimicking or parroting Farage, isn't it?
And to what end? Because I suppose, do you think, having worked inside the Home Office, when we hear a lot about being full up, right? We hear a lot about this sort of the idea that there are so many people coming across the channel, we can't take any more, we're full to bursting. This is what we're told. Those asylum seekers who are coming on these irregular routes, can we actually accommodate them? Is this fictitious?
There is space if we want to bring disused accommodation back into use. So we saw during the pandemic, for example, there was a scheme brought in by Robert Jenrick, actually, who was housing minister at the time, who it was called Everyone In, and it was basically like everybody who was street homeless could be put up in disused accommodation. Some of the shelters were closing, so they brought like office spaces, loads of disused accommodation back into use, managed to accommodate like everybody that was street homeless because of social distancing guidelines. And then as soon as like the first lockdown lifted, people were evicted back onto the streets again. But I mean, like it wasn't massively successful in the long term, but it showed in the short term that people can be accommodated if if there's the political will to do it and investment on that side of things.
Did you get a sense that there was, for a number of years, there were questions over why certain asylum claims weren't being processed? Did you feel that perhaps they were being held intentionally?
there was a massive backlog of claims, which was just post-pandemic, it was just growing and growing and growing. And they weren't really doing anything to try and clear it. So asylum decision makers were supposedly actively being told not to process some claims. I don't know if that's particularly far-fetched, but what I know from researching the book is the decision makers that were being brought in were like sort of quite ill-equipped to actually do the job. So like there were lots of school leavers, there were people who worked in customer service jobs. That's not to be derogatory about those people. It's to say they don't have any experience of the asylum system or real understanding of what drove that person to leave. So, that's a really important part of like sitting in front of someone for 4, 6, 8 hours and them telling you, I've been tortured in my country, and you don't even know where that country is on the map. You can't even point to it on the map. Like, that is really important that we're getting the right people into those jobs and recruiting the right people. We're then not training them. And then people just leave because they're not being particularly well recompensed either. They're getting like 20, 22 grand for making these like life and death decisions as they're spoken of. So yeah, I think it's like getting the right people into the jobs, which Labour are trying to do. They've like massively like increased the number of people that they're recruiting into the jobs. Who knows whether they're the right people? I'm not quite sure. But yeah, there was a massive backlog. There still is a massive backlog. I just don't know how much is actually being done to clear that backlog and whether we've got the right people in to do those jobs.
At the end of the book, you have a number of recommendations, and I don't want you to list them off because you have like a sort of a well-reasoned, thought-out argument of how you get to them, and I think it's important that people go and read the nuance of the book. But perhaps is there one that you would suggest that's not like a fix-all, but one that would be quite easily implemented?
I think it goes back to those safe routes and resettlement. And I think we saw with Ukraine, for example, how quickly we can welcome people. We can open up routes and we can accommodate 160,000 people in 6 months. People can fly Ukrainian flags out of their houses and out of their cars. My son's cartoon, his favorite cartoon, had like how to say welcome in Ukrainian and stuff. Like, it was just such a warm welcome. And then by contrast, we've got what happened with Afghans who had worked with or alongside the British government, the military, who were basically being left to die, as they said, like they felt utterly betrayed. And so many people are still in hiding there, or they're in Pakistan at risk of deportation back into Afghanistan. Like, we've totally failed Afghans. So I think we know that because there is a precedent with the Ukraine schemes, we know that people can be brought over safely. We just need to get some of those going again.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.